The US president's controversial proposals are garnering global attention. From taking over Gaza to annexing Canada and Greenland, Donald Trump's comments make headlines nearly every day. So what purpose does the strategy serve, and how should the world react? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. US President Donald Trump has made headlines around the world since his return to the White House. He appears to relish any opportunity to upstage, outrage, and perhaps more importantly, control the media narrative, whether it's suggesting Canada become America's 51st state, renaming the Gulf of Mexico, or threatening a military takeover of Greenland. Trump is dominating international news. But the White House has had to walk back many of his statements, with staff scrambling for answers to a flood of inquiries. So can Trump's administration sustain the breakneck speed at which he's announcing changes and initiatives? And what are the dangers in perpetuating this relentless shock-and-awe media strategy? We'll explore those questions and more in a moment, but first, this report by Michael Apple.
Oh, I think we have a 10. We have a 10.
God bless you, Mr. President.
Since Donald Trump's return to the White House, he's made one startling statement after another.
We're going to be changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America.
But what may appear to be absolute mayhem could be organized chaos.
I think that I should talk to President Trump.
Donald Trump.
An American football strategy called flooding the zone refers to weakening the opposing team's defenses by swamping them with options. They simply don't know where to focus.
There's only so much they can handle. First of all, they're not particularly bright. They're not particularly hardworking, so you can overwhelm the system quite easily.
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Steve Bannon was the president's advisor during Trump's first term. While Bannon hasn't returned to the White House after he and Trump fell out, it would appear his strategy never left. The US president has wasted no time in alienating his biggest trading partners, antagonizing allies, and bewildering critics.
We're going to put very serious tariffs on Mexico and Canada, because Canada, they come through Canada too, and the drugs that are coming through are at record numbers.
The headache for the Trump administration? Sometimes he's all talk.
He largely backed down on Canada, largely backed down on Mexico, Panama, and so he has this deliberate policy, as we know, it's a stated policy of some of his advisors, of coming out with so many shocking things that it's almost impossible to focus on any of them.
Hours after the State Department announced US vessels would be passing through the Panama Canal for free, the Panama Canal Authority issued a statement, translated here, denying any changes to its fees. Trump's gamble, in this case at least, hasn't paid off. It's early days, but Trump's media whirlwind threatens to sweep up everything in its path.
What a nice picture this is, huh, Governor?
As the saying goes, a lie travels faster than the truth. And in this case, accountability could crumble in the confusion. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests. From Washington, D.C., we're joined by Isenstadt, a senior political reporter from Axios, who covers the Trump White House and the Republican Party. In London is Peter Oborne, a columnist for Middle East Eye and the author of How Trump Thinks. And also in Washington, D.C. is Eric Ham, a U.S. political analyst and former congressional staffer. A very warm welcome to all of you. Alex, let me start with you in Washington, D.C. What do you think Trump and his administration are doing by signing so many executive orders, unleashing so many initiatives, generating so many headlines all at once?
So a couple things. One is that he wanted to come out of the gate, show that he was trying to accomplish all the objectives that he outlined during the campaign. He outlined a very ambitious domestic agenda during the campaign, and he wants to show his supporters and voters that he's going to follow through on that. Two is that Trump loves to create chaos. He did this during his first term, and he believes that as a practical matter, creating chaos keeps his opponents, keeps the media off balance, and that's what he's doing here. And three, what his team has said is that basically they only really have a couple of years to get done the things that they want to get done, and that, you know, after the midterms are over next year, and after Trump really becomes a lame duck, and things become a lot harder for him things get harder for him. He loses the political capital that he once had, and it's harder for him to achieve the agenda that he's laid out.
Yeah, I want to pick apart all of those objectives over the course of this show. Peter, let me come to you with one of the objectives of if the strategy is to overwhelm the media, the opposition, so that they can't focus on any one thing that the administration is doing. Is it working?
Well, I don't know. I think there is a problem about this kind of strategic analysis, what's insidery analysis of what the Trump administration is trying to do. Let's actually look at what it means to the rest of the world. I've just come back from the West Bank, from Jerusalem, from Jordan. And here, if you see the statements by the US president, he is planning a program of ethnic cleansing of Gaza. That is a crime under international law. That proposal is going to have devastating consequences to Palestinians and also to neighboring countries. So, insidery take on, is he trying to confuse the US press, doesn't take us very far. Let's look at the reality of what he's doing. And it is, as I say, he's
But Peter, let me ask
crimes.
you about the reality of what he's doing on that specific point. Given just how incredibly unrealistic this plan of forcibly displacing 2.3 million Palestinians out of Gaza is, Egypt and Jordan is not going to take them. Given how unrealistic it is, what is the political strategy then behind suggesting such a plan?
Well, I'm not as sanguine as you are about it being unrealistic. The United States is, for all of its current confusion, is the most powerful nation in the globe with massive military and financial resources. I completely reject your suggestion that it's unrealistic, and I also note, this is crucial, by the way, the enormous signal it sent to the far right in Israel to carry on the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, the lawlessness which is already going on. We saw Bezalel Smotrich, the administrator of the West Bank, greeting with acclaim the Trump announcements. And so this is monumentally consequential in the real world. I do accept part of the analysis, which is that Mr. Trump doesn't really understand how the world works. He's a cunning political maneuverer, but I think it's more sensible and more urgent to look at the real world consequences of what he's doing, and they are terrible.
Let me bring Eric in on that. Eric, how do you see when Donald Trump says things like the US is going to take over Gaza, it's going to annex Canada, it's going to take over Greenland, take back the Panama Canal? When is there a political strategy of saying such things, that seem absolutely shocking and unrealistic? Do you make them more realistic by repeating them enough times?
No, not at all. In fact, if we look at his efforts to try to retake Canada, we see how that simply just failed spectacularly, where we saw Donald Trump had to actually pull back from those punishing tariffs that he wanted to implement on Canada. And quite frankly, what it did was it actually poked the bear. We have now seen many Canadians are actually boycotting U.S. products still. Also, I think what we're seeing from Donald Trump is simply misreading the facts on so many issues, suggesting that Canada's deficit with the United States makes the United States weaker, when we know the numbers that he continues to spout, $250 billion deficit for the United States, is more like $40 billion. And when you take out the oil exports from Canada, the United States actually has a surplus. And so while Donald Trump does have this flood the zone strategy, I think what we're seeing, even with that strategy, while it is certainly causing tremendous chaos and confusion, and making it very difficult for the press to follow along. We're already beginning to see the limits, as we are seeing now. Judges are actually repealing many of these executive orders. And also now with the number of demonstrations and the pushback, we're seeing just how potentially weak Donald Trump could be, at least on the legislative front, where, of course, that's where you make long-term policies to actually fulfill your legacy. And right now, Donald Trump is struggling with that.
Alex, is this disorienting for journalists covering the White House? And as Eric mentioned, we are seeing pushback on many things already. You know, the attempts to freeze federal funding, a judge has halted those. The threats of imposing 25% taxes on Mexico and Canada, that hasn't happened. I mean, there's a long list of things already now. But are we missing the missteps that the Trump administration is taking when they make these bold new announcements every day?
Well, the reality is that there's only so many journalists, and there's only so much time. And so reporters can only do so much. But that said, reporters are doing a lot, and they are documenting a lot of the things that Trump has sort of scaled back or walked back. And so, for example, yesterday, when his administration started to sort of soften some of his original comments on Gaza, that got coverage. When he decided to delay the tariffs on Mexico and Canada, that got coverage as well. And so journalists can't do everything, but they're able to document a lot of the moves as they happen in real time.
And does that coverage showing that he's not actually able to achieve his agenda at this breakneck speed, that he's being challenged by the courts, that he has to walk back on his spokespeople, his Secretary of State have to walk back on the things that he said about Gaza a day earlier? Peter, do they affect him at all?
I think we will learn a lot more in the sort of weeks, months to come. Quite a lot of his measures, I mean, which are real measures, which have happened, the stripping of US aid and so forth, the collapsing of US soft power, are likely to cause real calamities in the real world. Just think about the removal of aid from Africa. I think what you'll see is that China will now, I think what we are seeing is the collapse of US power across the globe. You may think that's a good thing, you may think it's a bad thing, but if you're China and you see that Jordan's just had $1.2 billion removed from its national budget by this whimsical decision by the US president, I think that China will gently come in. You see the same it's terribly dangerous in Somalia, in Africa, where you have al-Shabaab, a terrorist organization. It's been held back partly by US subventions because they've been training the police force and so forth, and that's gone. So Shabaab is going to be greatly enhanced, made more powerful, sabotage the Somalia state. Now, eventually US citizens are going to be killed as a result of these reckless actions, perhaps sooner rather than later. We had a whiff of it in Washington in the terrible, catastrophic crash. So I rather like the point made by my predecessor that this can come back and bite the president very hard.
Eric, we've heard from Alex about how disorienting this can be for the media, but what they are able to do and what they are able to cover. The Democrat Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries called a meeting last week, he said, to discuss a comprehensive three-pronged counter-offensive against Trump blitz. I mean, how is this for Democrats? How do they manage to, fight the torrent to fight back against some of the initiatives?
Well, honestly, and quite frankly, it's going to be very, very difficult for Democrats. They don't have any levers of power. And quite frankly, they're the only negotiating tool that they have at their disposal is the budget process, which we're now seeing play out as the government now has to find a way to fund the government beginning in March. And of course, there is the debt ceiling. And so those are two areas where Democrats can actually push back, particularly given the very, very tight numbers that the House Republican majority hold. They only have a 3-seat majority, so they can ill afford to lose any seats, any votes there. And I think that's going to be deeply problematic. will Democrats actually hold strong in these negotiations? That's, I think, the very key question. We've never seen Democrats actually try to push the limit, particularly on the debt ceiling. And so I think that could be an area where, while Democrats do have leverage, it's unclear, at least at this point, if they're prepared to actually use it.
And Alex, how much political capital does Trump actually have at the moment? Does all of this projection of strength actually obscure some real political weakness? He entered his second term in office with an approval rating of 47%, the lowest of any newly elected president in the modern era.
Sure. So the reality is that as a newly elected president, he has a fair amount of political capital. His party controls both houses of Congress. Democrats are off balance, trying to find their identity, trying to figure out how they want to push back on Trump's policies. So he has, for the moment, a fair amount of capital. Now, if the public were to start to sour on his agenda, if we get closer to next year's midterm election and it looks like his party is about to lose control of one or both houses and they're going to lose seats and he starts to lose further in popularity, then he starts to lose capital. But for right now, he has a lot of power and that could change. But for the moment, he's got capital and he's trying to cash in on it.
And how much capital would you say the Republicans have? Because they have a razor-thin edge in the House of Representatives. It's not much bigger in the Senate. And Trump couldn't get any of his agenda. He couldn't get most of his agenda through Congress, could he?
So he's got a tough fight when it comes to the House, just because, as you point out, the margin is so slim, and it's going to take a lot of negotiating power to get through, especially through the House. And so that's going to be a challenge for him. And once when he stops doing executive orders and he starts having to push laws through Congress, things are going to get a lot more complicated for him.
And Peter, when Alex talks about how he could, Eric, I'll come to you in just a moment, but Peter, when Alex talks about how Trump can lose political capital as his term goes on, if the things he are doing are, unpopular, if he isn't able to push his agenda through, we've already seen that he can't get some of it through. When does it have an impact on the people who voted for him? We saw him lose some of his popularity during his first term, especially over his handling of the pandemic.
I don't want to present myself as an expert on the American political system, but can I make one observation? I think it's really interesting to see how it's going to be received internationally. Here in London, it's clear we have the Sir Keir Starmer, a Labour government, or traditionally allied maybe to the Democrats, doing its best to suck up to Mr. Trump. We had the Foreign Secretary refuse to condemn the nightmare announcement about Gaza, for instance. And he's attacking NATO. It's extraordinary. 2 NATO allies so far, Denmark and Canada, have been attacked. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which has been the buttress of American power for 70 years, and suddenly he's trying to sabotage it and undermine it. And that is to what extent is there going to be, from traditional US allies, a real kickback?
And how much patience do you think the traditional US allies have? We've heard from the European Commission chief, Ursula von der Leyen, again this week, saying the same thing that she has since he entered his second term in office, which was that we need to find common ground.
Yeah, they are bending over backwards, and it's getting quite humiliating. I think that the rest of the world may turn against America. What is happening here is that Trump is redefining the way the United States is seen across the globe. We now understand, it's always been partly true, by the way, the United States of America under Trump is a rogue state, in the same way that the Soviet Union was a rogue state before 1990, and of course since. It can't be trusted. It breaks all its agreements. It's unpredictable. It's the biggest danger to world peace. All of these things are the case under Trump. And I think the rest of the world, it's becoming impossible to deal with, and he will force natural allies to form other alliances. And we are seeing the nature of American power, which has up to now been clothes in a velvet glove, being really exposed, and it's ugly to see.
Eric, what do you make of that the United States is at danger of becoming a rogue state under Donald Trump? And I know you wanted to come in earlier as well.
Well, I've actually written in a column where I do say that the United States has gone rogue. But back to your original point about Donald Trump's approval rating, look, we see Donald Trump coming into office actually having an approval rating 10 points lower than what Joe Biden's was when he came into office. In addition to that, when you look at a number of the executive orders that Donald Trump has already implemented, many of those are very unpopular. So is his tech friend, Elon Musk. And so I think what we're seeing in terms of Donald Trump's political capital, he didn't have much when he came in because he only won with 49% of the vote. And then, of course, his approval rating is not even at 50%. And when we're seeing these continuing rollbacks and so much chaos, I think Donald Trump's political capital is that little bit which he had, he's beginning to squander very rapidly. And I think it's going to be only that much more difficult for him to actually be able to make legislative gains, particularly through the Congress, where you actually have lasting impact. And I think that's where Donald Trump is going to be very, very troubled, to say nothing of his ability to actually operate internationally, as we already heard from Peter. Donald Trump is continuing to make enemies of his closest allies. And even those competitors are certainly finding opportunities like China to be able to take advantage of things like what we're seeing with the shuttering of USAID.
Alex, do you see it that way in regards to his political capital, and what do you see him doing with it while he has it?
Sure. Well, while he has it, he's doing the flood zone strategy that you mentioned earlier on, where he's trying to get as much done as he possibly can in a short amount of time. And part of that is he recognizes that that political capital likely won't last forever. For most presidents, it doesn't last forever.
And what will he do when it doesn't last forever?
Well, I mean, that's the question. He went through a long period during his first presidency where he didn't have a lot of political capital for most of the time he was president, but that didn't stop him from trying to push forward on the agenda that he wanted to push through. And so Trump isn't a typical political animal. He doesn't say to himself, well, now I need to go and scale back my ambitions. That's not really how he operates. And so we'll have to see what happens as the years progress as it relates to how he tries to push forward on his agenda.
Eric, you can come in.
What I would like to say is Donald Trump has learned a lot from his first term. We saw many very stinging and humiliating defeats during Donald Trump's first term. The thumbs down by John McCain on the attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Donald Trump having to pull back from comprehensive immigration reform because even many Republicans balked at that. The government shut down over the Christmas holiday. And so what Donald Trump is doing this term is he's actually trying to stay away from Congress. And he recognizes through executive orders, he can still continue to give this aura of a strong man, someone who is in charge and who can get things done. The problem with that is we are seeing many of those judges that got through during the Biden administration are now beginning to actually push back hard on many of Donald Trump's policies. In fact, there was one judge who actually looked at Donald Trump's birthright citizenship executive order and said he couldn't believe that an actual lawyer had actually presented that as an order. And so I think what we're seeing here is while many cannot cover all of what Donald Trump is certainly doing, when you do actually peel back the layers, you are seeing a president who, quite frankly, is very weak at this time, even though he's attempting at every avenue to show and present strength.
And Peter, however weak he might be at this time, he is the US president. He is the president of one of the most powerful countries in the world. And you seem to believe him. You seem to take him at face value at what he says. What of his agenda, especially internationally, do you think he will be able to achieve in this term?
Well, what he can do is create total chaos. He seems to be in the Middle East. He's enfranchised the far right in Israel, and the consequences are terrible. And if he progresses with his strategy, he's going to start to bring down his allies across the region. Jordan might easily collapse and turn into a 500-kilometer war zone against Israel. You've got Egypt, which is very vulnerable to the Palestinians start to arrive there in numbers. So I think it's a terrifying moment for for America's allies. And I also, can I make an observation about American domestic politics?
Yes.
I think he's okay so long as there's not a recession, but his policies very much remind me of the policies which led to the Great Depression of the 1930s, i.e., imposing these tariffs, which is a war on the economy. And I can see if America does go into recession, Trump will be blamed, and then it will be obvious, perhaps even to his supporters, that they've got a gibbering idiot in the White House.
One that they voted back into power, though. Alex, we just have about 1 minute left in the program. What is your strategy for keeping the White House honest over the next 4 years?
Well, it's about staying on top of them every day. It's about not taking necessarily everything they say for granted, but pushing further in terms of your reporting, talking to more people, talking to people in the federal bureaucracy, talking to people in the West Wing, and talking to people all around Washington to get the sense of, what is actually happening in this White House. There's a lot that's going on. And during Trump's first term, it took years to fully understand everything that he did. And so you have to develop a wide source network, and you need to really press people on what is the impact of his policies.
All right, that is our discussion for today. Thank you to all three of you. That's Alex Isenstadt in Washington, D.C., Peter Oborn in London, and Eric Ham in Washington, D.C. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.